Welcome to VINTed with Scout Driscoll. Come along with me on my journey into the wine world, where I share thoughtful conversations with wine industry leaders. Get ready for marketing insights from branding and design to sales and social media, and the answer to the ultimate question: what moves wine? I'm Scout Driscoll, founder of VINTed Studio and host of VINTed, where I ask top leaders in the wine industry and craft beer industry, how do you move wine? Past episodes include conversations on connecting with younger consumers with Rob McMillan, founder and EVP of the Silicon Valley Bank Wine Division, and Elise Terlato of Terlato Wines International. On today's episode, we're talking with Matt Tanaka, founder and creative director of the Stout Collective. But before we dive in, here's a quick word from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by VINTed Wine Branding and Design, where rich storytelling meets smart design. At VINTed, our studio goes beyond the label, guiding wine brands through strategy-rich branding and packaging evolutions, websites, point of sale, and more. Our work with Cooper's Hawk has helped them grow the nation's largest wine club with over 540,000 members. You can learn more about VINTed at VINT.studio, and for a free label audit for your brand, email me at hello@vint.studio. I am so excited today to introduce a good friend, Matt Tanaka, founder and creative director of Stout Collective, a beer and branding design studio. He lives in Chicago with his wife and business partner, Laura, who is so badass, by the way. There are two boys and the world's sleepiest French bulldog, Bento. Matt and I go way back in the design and branding world here in Chicago, and I've been so impressed with his success in launching and growing Stout Collective into what has to be the most successful craft beer-focused design studio in America. I'm calling it. Bravo, Matt. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. You're too kind. The intro is too kind. I feel like I'm very excited to be here and, out of my element. You're in a whole other league. I'm just here to talk about beer.
So this episode is all about packaging design and marketing. I know some of you are listening thinking, but Matt, he designs beer. What the heck? But there is so many insights to be gained from the craft beer industry. And we were just chatting recently about how, as part of my mission to help the wine industry connect with younger and more diverse audiences, that there are so many things that the craft beer industry does so well. So I wanted to dig into his experience and kind of grab some of that mojo to inspire some of you winery owners, wine marketers, and to lean in a little bit into what's happening in the craft beer world. So Matt, let's get started. We're going to have you tell our listeners just a little more about Stout Collective and how you guys help your clients.
Sure. Yeah. So Stout Collective is a brand strategy and design studio for breweries. We are based in Chicago. We've been around for a little over 7 years, and we're a full service creative studio for breweries. On the surface, that's a lot of design projects, a lot of logo and identity design, a lot of packaging design. For note, we did something like 450 beer labels last year. We did a little more than that the year before. There's just a lot of volume in the beer space that I imagine is a little different from wine. But we also do a lot of strategic work kind of behind the scenes with a lot of our clients. Typically, people who start breweries tend to not be business people first. They usually get into it because they love making beer or they want to open something that they care very much about. And then they find themselves as a business owner. So a lot of times we're kind of coming in for design and then we're helping with strategy as well.
You are literally giving my pitch. So if you need that line,
we'll switch.
Call VINTed. If you need that for beer, call Stout.
I love it. Great.
Which is so funny. So Matt and I met when he was doing all the marketing over at a distributor here in Chicago, and he went out on his own, hung his shingle, and created Stout Collective. And it's so funny because like VINTed in some ways, very unintentionally, is the girl version of Stout Collective. And I know you have lots of women who work for you, but we're like all women in wine, and you guys are like really baller dudes and like craft beer. So I was not trying to steal your idea. But it's just really funny because we do the exact same thing at VINTed, and we focus on the wine world. And I think it's so funny how different the perceptions are in both of these worlds. Like at Design Scout, our broader studio, we work with clients across industries. I actually met Matt because we had designed a craft beer label for a brand here in Chicago that we all loved. And it's so there's just so much synchronicity in how we operate. And I think that Sure. That dual vision, like literally on the split screen here, it's like beer and wine, and the way people perceive marketing for these two very similar industries is so vastly different. I think of the wine world. People always talk about like the lapel pin and the sommelier and like the farm that it's grown on. I mean, think of craft beer. It's about like the heavy metal they listen to, or like how like they only sell 200 and people show up and have a giant party all week. Like there's all these different ways that perception is so fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So today's a day to help some of the wine world, just tap in a little bit into the insights that the beer world leans into.
Sure. I'm just here selfishly as a spy to learn about the wine world. We looked at the beer side looks to wine all the time, and it's like they seem to have it together. They seem to understand things that we need to tap into. So yeah, I'll tell you whatever, but I just want you to fill me in on what the beer world needs to know.
Yeah. And I feel like the wine industry does a lot amazingly, amazingly well. There's just there is a little bit of attrition there goes the train. Sorry, but there's a little bit of attrition in younger consumers. And there's huge opportunity with the way that the wine industry markets itself to just break wide open into, using these marketing techniques or approaches or even brand approaches that they haven't to just tap in with so many more consumers. So I think it's the biggest opportunity for the wine world. Not that they're not doing it well, but for example, boomers are twice as likely to bring wine to a party than a younger person of any generation below the boomers, which demonstrates how wine is really losing a foothold, So I want to break down some of the ways that we're keeping it fresh in the beer world and how wineries can learn some of those best practices. So let's start with some of the offerings that breweries offer. So a winery might often have like a handful of varietals and maybe occasional like annual interesting release. But like, what's the craft beer world doing in terms of their beer offerings that we could learn from?
Yeah, a lot is the short answer. And what's so funny about that statement to you about like the wine industry looking to the younger generations as they're choosing wine less. We look at the same thing even below millennials. So Gen Z that's reaching legal drinking age, they're drinking beer at a much lower level than millennials and Gen X and everything beyond that. So it's funny how much perspective changes things from where you are. You're always looking at what's next. And for us, it's some of the same challenges, just from a different spot. But
generation
in terms of
seltzer, generation CBD, generation cannabis.
Yeah. Too many options. There's so much out there. And yeah, for us, what's interesting about the beer space is the proliferation of SKUs over the last decade has been insane for us. I would say I started this company 7 years ago. When we started, there were 4,000 operating breweries in the United States. We just passed 9,000 this year. So the number of breweries is growing even over the last year, over 2021. A little under 800 new breweries opened, which is kind of shocking if you think about considering what our world has gone through in the last years, that breweries are still opening at that rate. Then within a brewery, instead of having the old model was you'd have a couple flagship beers, 4 to 5 beers. You'd have a rotating seasonal that comes out a different SKU 4 times a year, and then maybe a couple limited releases or something uber specialty. For some breweries, that's still true, but for the majority of breweries, that model is completely flipped. And breweries have hundreds of SKUs, sometimes thousands of SKUs. So the space has just gotten very, very crowded. There's a lot of opportunities there, and there's a lot of challenges there.
Yeah. Well, how much fun is that from a design perspective, though? Like so figuring out how to dig into such a widespread brand and still stay on brand, because you have to be, it's not like most breweries don't just like change the name on the label. It's a whole wardrobe change for every single SKU. So that just, from a design perspective, I feel like that's so fresh and fun. It reminds me, and I'm probably going to mention them a few times in this episode, but like Tank Garage Winery, one of my favorite wineries. They think of every wine they release like an album cover, and they never release the same wine twice. And it's always something new and fresh. And I think that's something they've done very well to kind of pull from that craft beer model. I think just from a design perspective, it's so much more fun.
Yeah, it's definitely fun. And then it's challenging, and it's, I always go to that side because that's what we're in every day, but it's definitely fun. One of the opportunities there is you're engaging consumers constantly. So when a brewery under that model that's releasing that many SKUs always has an opportunity to be in front of consumers and feel new, to have that kind of spark. The benefit in that is consumers are seeing something new, and that's exciting and kind of speaks to collectability. The challenge in that is sort of exactly what you got to in the middle of that, is like building brand consistency and being able to build brand equity in a space where we're constantly changing is a challenge. As an example, a client of ours called Other Half Brewing, they're based in Brooklyn. Their model at the beginning was to they're releasing 2 to 5 new labels every week. So every Tuesday and every Friday, they're putting out brand new packaged product every week. Then they opened a bunch of other locations.
That's insane, Matt.
It is insane.
It's a new label every week, like a new design.
Oh yeah. Yeah. 2 to 3 twice a week.
It's like taking social media and slapping it on a beer can.
Yeah. And you can imagine, and then they open a bunch of locations. So they have a tap room. They have 2 in Brooklyn now. They have 1 in DC. They have 1 in Rochester, upstate New York. They have 1 in Philadelphia, and then they have 1 at Rockefeller Center. So you start at that model, then you add all these different locations, you leave the state. And the challenge there is, how do you build brand consistency within that when you're still putting out so much new product? So there's a couple things that we do within that space. One, when we think about design systems for those labels, it's pretty loose. So we have a couple things that are consistent. There's an illustration style that's consistent, and then there's a die cut that's consistent. The label shape it's a 12-ounce shaped label on a 16-ounce can. So that in itself stands out quite a bit. And beside that, we had to invent a bunch of design rules to try to keep up with that speed of release while still giving consumers something to hold on to. So I won't go into all the details, but a couple examples are, we have a series, they like to release beers that reference the word green. So we have any synonym or type of green gets a name at some point. So like there's like money could be one, like that's a green thing, or broccoli is one that they use a lot, or other vegetables. So when we go down that series, we have a specific character illustration style, kind of a cute flat character, a personified vegetable or cheese brick or whatever that we use. So we know when we're doing a specific line of beers, we're going to start within that character, and that character has become recognizable, and then that line of beers becomes recognizable. Wow. Another one we use is we color code hops. So when we're using a beer that is a specific hop dominant beer, we'll use a specific color to represent that beer. So that means if we have a dual hop beer with 2 different hops, we might use 2 of those colors. We might find a gradient in between them. We're starting at a place so that there's something for the consumer to kind of hold on to.
Got it. And we can put photos of any of these on our show notes for those of you listening on audio, or if you want to check them out. So when you listen to this, we'll go to the site and you can take a look at the photos of these. That's so fun. And it's what a tsunami of design.
Yes,
and it really
hard to handle.
It's hurting cats. And congratulations for managing that and such a great client. So let's move into packaging though. I think,
Sure.
By and large, it feels like breweries are way more likely to take risks. Their packaging lean more into countercultural aesthetics. What, in your opinion, are the benefits of breweries, taking risks, and what do they experience in a good way by changing up this packaging? I think you talked about that a little bit recently, but in general, like how does it benefit them to be more risky with their design? And I'm also kind of wondering, is there a backlash where people are starting to get more minimal with their design and less wild and crazy because you can't keep topping your neighbor down the street that's doing something ridiculous,
Yeah. Yeah. Are you sure you're not an analyst in the beer design space? I feel like you just summarized exactly the issue that we're facing right now. I mean, when you think about that amount of SKUs and that kind of release structure where people are constantly putting out new labels, you have so much design coming from a bunch of different people in completely different markets, different aesthetics. You run into that problem of things start to look the same. And I feel like from a 10,000 foot view, what we see sometimes is something kind of catches on, whether that's an illustration style or like an angle or a concept kind of catches on. Then you see a bunch of people rush into that. And then somebody else tries to go dramatically the other direction. Then it kind of catches up to that. Trends from a design standpoint happen at warp speed in our world because things are coming out at warp speed, which is always really interesting. It's the benefit to breweries is that they have maybe more opportunity to take risks, as you said, to play into spaces that haven't been done before. Sort of the challenge to everybody designing in beer is like, how do I create a beer label that feels different from the other beer labels? Like that's a benefit to us. And then the challenge is that carving out space within a crowded area where you have to move really fast and then trying to hold on to a single brand identity is very challenging.
Yeah. And I feel like when it's a wine, there's so much pressure on that 1 year's release.
Mm-hmm.
Like if it's especially it's like this one vintage and like it's going to be in the bottle. And also like people aren't going to see that wine for a couple of years sometimes, or they're going to collect every wine in the vertical. And like just having, that it just, we were talking briefly earlier about how like there's this perception that wine is more expensive and more elegant or has, this, I dare not say professional, but, but I think part of it is that like, it's your precious little baby that you're releasing into the world. Like, with craft beer, it's like, hey, I made this with this thing in the back room with hops. And they're like, can it label it? So that
Totally. Yeah.
and speed, I think that really influences craft beer versus the wine world. But I do think too, like, I want wineries to stand out and I want them to feel a little permission to not live within the traditional design aesthetics of their AVM or of their style of wine. Especially like there are certain places where you just, the second you see a wine from Alsace, you're like, oh, that's a French Alsace wine. Done. Like I just get it immediately. So I respect tradition in that way, but I think people really can take more risks in standing out. And you see that all the time in some of these, what I call kind of like grocery brands or retail brands where like they're getting a lot of success there with Freak Show, with 19 Crimes, with, Orange Swift to a certain extent. So I just want to give everyone that little push, like do something different, be yourself.
Totally. I love that.
And play.
For us, I sometimes find myself kind of pulling back down in the opposite direction with our beer clients. Something kind of our internal why, it's something we say within the doors of Stout a lot, is that we exist to help build better breweries. That's kind of the thing that we say. What we typically mean by that is better design, more strategic, healthier, more holistic, more long-term, that kind of stuff. Basically a more thoughtful approach, because the temptation in beer is, because it happens so fast and because things are shifting around constantly, to just do something to get it out the door that's cool and like, oh, that's cool. We like that artist. Let's put that on the can. That's a pretty looking label, and just move forward. Sometimes our job is really to root people a little bit and say, we want to build a brand that lasts. Like we want your brewery in it for the long haul, which means, yes, we should do the fun stuff. Yes, we should take risks, but let's do it with an eye on the future and say, if we're going to do this thing, let's make sure it's not totally random, unless literally the point is random. So make sure we're like thinking more holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think part of the challenge there too is like some of the biggest early names in craft beer were well known for just doing whatever the hell they wanted to. And so that becomes your the forebearers. You think of like Three Floyds, where it's just like weird, kind of bad with respect illustrations and, like zombies and heavy metal. Like there's so many different brands that really were like, I don't know, we're just going to do whatever's cool. Or my brother did this thing for me. And so I feel for you as a designer. I feel
a lot of that. Cats,
asking people to grow up a little bit, like I've been in business for 20 years. And like, I have held a lot of hands in the brand standard world, especially when you get like a eccentric founder that's like, well, thank you for the standards, but this is not, but I want to do something cool. Like, well, this is cool and it's you and it's intentional. So
and cool is relative.
Yeah. Let's move on to marketing. So are there any marketing tactics that wineries should borrow from the craft beer industry?
I don't know. You think the beer industry is doing well? What's interesting to me is this sort of where we are right now in the beer space. We usually refer to it as like the third wave of craft beer. So like this proliferation SKUs, a ton of crazy growth, young brands, new brands, moving really fast. That kind of came up, like was given a big boost with social media, specifically Instagram. So even over the last 5, 6, 7 years, Instagram is the primary marketing vehicle for most of the breweries of that style. They were able to find an audience that was just as equally as interested in the aesthetic and the look and the vibe, the design or brand, as the liquid. And so there was an interesting way to be able to bridge that gap a little bit. We're selling a physical product, liquid in a bottle or a can, and we are marketing it by getting people to understand the vibe and the feeling around that liquid and can, or liquid and can or the bottle, which was super successful. Now as Instagram has grown, as audiences has grown, and that audience is getting older, things like social media shifted towards a younger generation. Things like TikTok are obviously huge and prominent breweries have really struggled adopting to that world, partially because I think of the age demo of those social media accounts, and breweries just don't really know how to play in that space very well yet.
Yeah.
On the flip side, what we've been doing a lot, what we've been seeing a lot is sort of a return to the old school. We're seeing email marketing come back in a pretty big and powerful way. And I think part of that is e-commerce for beer is brand new and is kind of like pushing breaking ground. We've never had e-commerce before up until the pandemic. And even now e-commerce is relatively new. So it's kind of like watching the industry discover how to be internet brand, how to be a shoe brand from 10 years ago. Now the beer industry is sort of dealing with that.
Yeah, same in the wine world for sure. I feel like the idea of online DTC is just skyrocketing. I think it went up by like 16% in the first few months of the pandemic. So
yeah, wow,
it's huge, and I'm glad to hear you guys haven't mastered it yet either. I personally have not mastered TikTok, but next week on the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing a TikTok master, Amanda McCrossan. She is Sam Vivant, and she is going to teach all of us how to use TikTok. So if
I'll learn too.
Yeah, if anyone from the craft beer world wants to listen in, Amanda's amazing. She's got 140,000 followers on TikTok. She is going to give like a straight up how to. So that'll be really fun. But I think, one of the ways that I like how craft beer markets is they're just not afraid to be very on a local level. Like I feel like a lot of wineries feel like they have to have this national presence, or at least present in a very professional way, and they're a little afraid to stay kind of that local vibe. Whereas I feel like every brewery feels like my neighborhood brewery. And
and I would argue. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, go ahead.
I would argue that is successful marketing for most breweries at this size. There was a point 5-ish years ago where a lot of breweries were expanding their distribution pretty rapidly. They were leaving their home markets at a very fast rate. That started to get challenging, and a bunch of breweries pulled back. And now the ones that are being successful are really the ones that have reinvested in owning the home market. There are so many breweries. That home market could mean your state, it could mean your city, it could literally mean your neighborhood. The neighborhood that I live in, Logan Square in Chicago, there's like 10 breweries that I can walk to from my house. So local is relevant or relative to where you are. But by refocusing on that area, a lot of breweries have been able to build an interesting following that can connect with them at a more on the ground level, kind of like a return to where things started with this part of the industry. And then when they leave home, when they do e-com, or they do splash distribution, or they do full distribution, they have built a reputation for being really cool or interesting or groundbreaking or quality where they are. And that reputation travels pretty well.
Yeah. And I think that's the part that the wine world can really take, given how tied wine is to the land and tied into that AVA. And I think a lot of people think of local in the wine world as this is where the grapes are grown. This is where we're proud to have our vineyard and our estate winery, et cetera, et cetera. But I encourage people to have moved beyond that into getting into the culture of where you are, really lean into the idea of that local place on a cultural level, not just a horticultural level, viticultural level.
That's really interesting. It's been a challenge for beer and not a problem for beer. The idea of where the brewery sits sometimes doesn't matter, and sometimes matters a lot for the liquid itself. So like hops are grown in very specific regions, and there's kind of I think a freedom in the beer space that maybe the wine space has, and I don't know the space well enough, or doesn't have, in that it can be whatever. You can put basically anything in a beer, and that's rewarded in a lot of ways. Like people want to see weird and crazy and wacky stuff. Ingredients can come from everywhere. Some of the best hops in the world come from New Zealand or come from Eastern Washington. So if a brewery is in small town Ohio, they can make equally great products by getting ingredients from these other locations. And it's all about a lot of other details, recipe experimentation, water, all of that.
Water.
Kind of
Yeah, I was going to say, it's all about your local water.
Yes, and that is a lot. Water treatment, very exciting part of the beer industry.
Beer's a lot of water.
A lot of water.
Okay, let's talk about your favorite beer packaging and why.
Is it allowed to be ours or should it be someone else's?
I don't care. I don't, and anyone listening, don't be sad if Matt doesn't mention it. He wants to talk about all of you. He can't. He told
they're
me
all
he
my
feels
favorites.
really guilty. They're all your favorites. It could be yours. It could be someone else's. It could be mine. Just kidding. But I would love to hear like if the wine folks are like, okay, who's doing really cool packaging?
All right.
Who's on your short list?
All right, I'm going to give you two, so that way I can say one of ours and one of someone else's that I respect. Right. So I can be a little selfish and a little not selfish. So ours is a brewery that is now defunct, but was one of my favorite, really fun, weird projects that created some really interesting labels. So they were called Ancillary Fermentation. It was a North Carolina-based brewery. The whole concept, and we kind of worked together on what the concept was, is it was a brewery that really only existed for a couple hours once a month. So every month we would brew 2 beers and we would have a party, and that party would be in a weird location. The beers would be thematic. So that's kind of where we started. Okay. We had to come up with a label style that matched that and made sense for it and was equally art driven and strange. So what we settled on was using found photography plus illustration to match the theme. So we would go diving through old vintage stores and thrift stores and find old Polaroids, and then we would manipulate the photos and add illustration to kind of create a visual tone poem kind of weird fun thing that would reflect the theme. And then we would have a party in a strange location. Like we had for the holidays, we did an office holiday party where we rented out a pretty typical cubicle office, and we had a party as if that was our office holiday party themed to the label. So that was a very fun, very strange, very
That's so creative. That's so fun.
It was very fun.
I love
the other one. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. The other one is a brewery called Grimm in New York. This is not our work. We're just really big fans of it. It's a sort of a partnership between two people. Lauren Grimm is one of the founders, and Greta, who's a illustrator, designer, artist, painter partner. They met in art school, and this brewery kind of started as a home brew project and grew over time. But they have been creating some of the most beautiful and different labels in the beer space. And kind of their approach to it is they, from what I understand, they sort of start with the feeling of what the beer is. They create a physical piece. They illustrate or paint a physical piece. Greta's a painter primarily. And then they work backwards into it being a beer label. So they don't start at CPG and commerce and like what works well on a shelf and what is the consumer going to recognize when they hold it in their hand, all that stuff. They're starting with it should feel right and interesting and beautiful and different and strange. And it just creates some really great work.
Nice. I can't wait to check those out. I wish I could have gone to your office party. That sounds amazing.
It was very fun.
Awesome. Okay. I'm about to hit you with my final question, but I really quickly touch on illustration because you mentioned it a few times. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, like, do you guys have in-house illustrators? Do you work with outside illustrators? Like, who are some of your favorite illustrators that you work with? And do you have them in-house?
Yeah. So we have 2 designers in-house full-time. They're both illustrators and they're both fantastic illustrators. And then we have kind of a wealth of freelancers that we work with, but we have like a few go-tos that we have like very specific styles that we know to go to for specific things. Kind of one of our things as a studio is we don't want to have a style. We don't want to have an agency style where you come to us if you want to look like this. Our job instead is to either help identify or build or recognize the style of a client and then kind of build a team around it. That's usually a combination of our in-house illustrators, designers, or specific freelancers with specific styles. So we've got a bunch of friends that we go to for, we need a specific illustration style, something wacky. We need a hand letterer for this more ornate label. We know where to go from there.
Yeah. And then you do 17 a week.
We do a lot of them real fast. It's not always like that. I will say sometimes we get more foresight, but that's the reality of the beer business.
Oh, I would love to do more beer, but I want it to all be barrel aged. So I have like
3 years to work on it.
A couple of years to work on it. I was kidding.
Yeah. Me too.
That blows my mind. Like the amount of labels you guys are churning out. It's
wild.
I'm jealous and not jealous. I'm like, wow, that's closing a lot of deals, Matt. And at the same time, I'm like, oh my God. That's not for me. Um,
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So I always wrap up these podcasts with asking my favorite question, which is what is your number one advice for wineries? And I'm going to change it a little bit for you. What's your number one advice for wineries who want to take a cue from the beard world to increase sales and move wine?
Yeah. I think sort of as an outsider on your space, this is an assumption I'm making, sort of looking at it, scanning the wine shelf with being pretty familiar with the beer shelf, is that, maybe relaxing the hold on what the word premium means and sort of what goes into that. At least from the outside, what I see is there's a lot of things that are associated with design that feel premium in the wine space. So another way to say that is like, I think a normal consumer could probably close their eyes and you could say, think about a wine label that's very expensive or premium or special. And they've probably got a picture in their head. And one of the things that has been successful for beer is kind of flipping that narrative a little bit and challenging consumers to try something, to be attracted to pick it up off the shelf because it's something interesting or different or kind of feels like their vibe, or they want to step into that vibe for an evening. And maybe they're not like a punk rock metal kind of person, but they kind of want to experience that for a little bit or be in that world for a little bit. And creating premiumness from within that creates a brand loyalty that has a completely different feeling, because if somebody becomes loyal to the idea of what you're doing. So when you put out new things or you grow, they're kind of there because they trusted you and feel like what you're doing is part of who they are, experimental. So yeah, I don't know if that is actually useful. It's just an insight that I pick up from looking at the wine shelf, that there seems to be I'm sure there's a lot of weight around that word in your space.
I 100% agree. 100%. And I think because you have so many other levels you can pull to convey premium. It's price, it's glass, it's, scarcity. And so often, the more premium the wine label is, the more devoid it is of storytelling. And you have these opportunities to create, like you said, that culture, that lifestyle, that experience that people are, want to sit down and I would say, like, I want a brand I want to sit down and have a beer with or have a glass of wine with. And if your wine looks like the kind of brand that I couldn't have a conversation with, or if I don't even know what we would talk about because your label is so devoid of personality to convey premium nature, then you have an opportunity to loosen that tie and then allow some of those other dials that you have to turn, convey expensive or premium or rare, without just relying on the label to do that. I think that's great advice. I love that.
I love that. I think that's a really interesting perspective to think about, like brand personality is like sitting down, having a conversation with this brand. I think is a really cool way to think about that. I'm going to steal that if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, and you think about social media too, like that's literally what it is. Someone sitting on their couch or avoiding their children or whatever, on their phone. And like you, when your brand has that culture and personality, then you're not scrambling for what am I going to say on TikTok, because but what you're going to say can't be a, hey, buy this. It has to be here's a little bit of insight. Here's some entertainment. Here's some fun. Here's some storytelling. I'm enriching you in some way, because it is leisure time, right? As much as I like to say that social media is leisure time, guess what? So is wine. Wine is leisure. So yeah, I completely agree. All right. So I've been talking to Matt Tanaka of Stout Collective. Matt, where can people learn more about Stout Collective and connect with you?
Sure. Yeah. They can visit our website at stoutcollective.com. We're on Instagram. I'm on Instagram at Matt Tanaka. Probably the best place to find us.
Awesome. And all of our clients at VINTed just run to Stout Collective because we're so cool. And all the Stout Collective clients just run to VINTed because we're just so trade. Cool. Yeah, we're just going to swap it up. Or maybe someday we'll just merge forces.
Great.
Like the dark side and the light side of the force coming together.
Take over the world.
Awesome. Well, that's all for this week's episode of VINTed. As always, you can head over to vint.studio to sign up for our email list, as well as check out all the links and resources in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. And to catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at Scout Driscoll, and of course on LinkedIn, where I kind of live all the time. And thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next time on the next episode of VINTed. Tune in for the next VINTed. Subscribe today. For future episodes, marketing advice, and more, follow me on Instagram at Scout Driscoll. Learn more about VINT's design and branding services for wineries at www.vint.studio.